role. Rather than being the hospitable alternative community it first appeared, it reflects the racist and heterosexist constraints of late capitalism, limiting and shaping Star's capacity for interdependence and care, as is shown in the numerous scenes throughout the film showing her tending vulnerable children, insects and animals. Although the position of these non-human animals seemed to echo her racialised vulnerability within the all-white mag crew, the hopeful possibility for interspecies connection is the potentially hopeful note upon which the film ends. The final scene of the film shows Jake approaching Star during a raucous group dance and placing a turtle wordlessly into her hands. After turning away from the dance and releasing the turtle into a nearby lake, Star is shown following it further and further into the water, submerging her shoulders and then her head below the surface. She's underwater for what feels like a really long time, but she ultimately does re-emerge, shown here, breaking the surface with a burst of energy and a flick of her dreadlocks. The soundtrack is abruptly silenced and we can hear only the sounds of water dripping from her hair, Star's own breath and the buzz of the fireflies around her. The return to the sounds of the natural world seemed to articulate the film's expansion of the crew's compromised response to anthropocentric heterocapitalism, and that's the potentially hopeful note upon which the film ends. However, although I've shown that the film does illuminate and resist the function of the dancing girl in the aesthetic reach of neoliberalism, looking to the political possibilities that might be beyond it, this note of optimism performs a turn away from the human communities that might have provided Star with sanctuary, and so feels unsatisfying as a response to the political structures that have isolated and marginalised her. So it's with that in mind that I turn to some final thoughts on two more new realist films featuring dancing girls, Sarah Gavron's Rocks and also Arnold's most recent film Bird, which I would suggest mobilised dance and music not just as a mode of critique, but as a means of producing cinematic spaces of respite and solidarity from the violence experienced by working class girls of colour. Of the examples that I will look at today, it's within Rocks that I find the most hopeful articulation of new realism's aesthetic political potential. So the film's about the titular character of Rocks, played by newcomer Bucky Becrae, who takes on the role of primary carer for her younger brother Emmanuel when their mother suddenly abandons them. Rocks offers a really interesting comparison to Fish Tank and American Honey in the way that it portrays and challenges resilience discourse through its evocation of working class dancing girls. Notably, the praise that was heaped upon Rocks in the popular press, I've got a slide of that in a moment, singled out the film's use of dance, repeatedly ascribing a resilient resonance to this scene where the girls dance to Afrobeat in a PE lesson. The staging of this dance sequence within a school setting marks a distinct difference from Fish Tank and American Honey. We know in Fish Tank that Mia's been excluded from school. We know that Star is a young carer, but we never see them interact really with any agents of the state. Both those protagonists are exceptional in precisely the terms facilitated by the neoliberal transfer of responsibility from state and institutional care and welfare to privatisation. And the isolation from state apparatus is one of Nwonka's main issues with Fish Tank, which he says sets out the geographical and social context of earlier social realism, but without examining the actual politics of Mia's environment through an interrogation of the state's role in her vulnerability. And that's in contrast to Rocks, which places a traditionally British social realist emphasis on geographical verisimilitude and shows Rocks interacting with state agents whilst maintaining the lyrical, poetic, haptic, stylistic qualities associated with new realism, primarily through music and dance. Its locations, for instance, and I love showing this because I wrote some of this paper at Queen Mary, which you can see the campus of in the top right-hand corner. Its locations show, and I know this, a very meticulous attention to the geographical specificity of its locale, and the tower block market and canal that we see Rocks traversing is all contained within roughly 3 square miles of Tower Hamlets. Like some of Arnold's cast, the cast of Rocks were non-professionals. Gavron and her screenwriter, Teresa Ikoko, recruited them through an extended audition and workshopping process through which the initial treatment and the final script from the film emerged. The collaborative co-production process undoubtedly informed the dance scene's emphasis on the collaborative reconstitution of spaces of spatial violence by Black girls. So these are the reviews that stress the resilient, joyful emphasis of the Afrobeat dance scene, but also the sense of friendship and solidarity that it conveys, which I would argue complicate the scene's resilient resonance. I'll play that clip, just a short bit of it so you can see what I mean now. To contextualise it, it takes place just after Rox has learned that her mother has left, and we can see that weighing heavily on her as she goes about her school day, and you can see it in her face a bit at the start of the clip. The framing of the sequence and the movements and also the facial expressions performed work to highlight the collaborative quality of the girls' physical movements, which exhibit the typically communicative qualities of African social dance and its various social dance offshoots. Rox initiates the dance with the basic moves of the shaku shaku, performing with a side maze, a smiling glance and a nudge of the shoulder, and inviting her best friend Samaya, played by Kosha Ali, to repeat the movement alongside her. The scene then frames the girls in medium close-up, the sense of their intimate closeness made visible through their gleeful grins that they exchange as they move. And invigorated, the other girls start to join in. Close-ups on their concentrating faces and shuffling feet emphasise their togetherness in the dance, but also the various inflections that their individual bodies bring to its performance. Quite unlike the isolated hip-hop dancing we see in Fish Tank, or the subsuming of group dance by capitalist frameworks in American Honey, what's aesthetically emphasised in the scene is a moment of solidarity framed within a state-sanctioned educational space that has historically constrained and oppressed Black girls. Read within the broader context of vulnerable non-white girls' lived experience of accessing state support outlined in this recent research by Girls Speak, this dance sequence might seem to be a disingenuous attempt to contextualise the depiction of a Black working class girl's experience at the sharp end of social policy and the care system within a broader network of institutional care. A depiction which holds none of the contention with state-sanctioned inequality that Nwonka calls New Realism to interrogate. But isolating that dance sequence overlooks the film's broader critique of state education and welfare and its disciplining and surveillance of Black girls, seen, for example, in this scene when a white male teacher polices their uniforms. The girls' defiant responses to his chastising of their jewellery and fashion choices express their capacity to, as Acelia Franklin Phipps puts it, create ways of existing within and against geographical spaces characterised by surveillance and violence to heal, cope and protect themselves. And we might consider the dance scene in the PE lesson as a similarly collaborative reconstitution of a space of spatialised violence. Important there is the framing of the sequence and the style of dance, but also the collaborative way that the film and the soundtrack was produced. The cast helped to shape the soundtrack through pre-production and filming, and they fell in love with this Jowa track, Bankudade, during the pre-production process when they were all invited to enjoy a dance class together, the cast and crew. And this clearly informed the scene's kinetic emphasis on friendship and community. So here we can see the genetic manoeuvres of social realism, creating a sonic and kinetic focus on girl bonding as a respite from everyday sites of spatial violence. Violence that the rest of the film shows is systematic and sustained rather than easily overcome in the manner that neoliberal resilience discourse suggests. Rox's mother's absence leaves her vulnerable to these everyday rituals. Rox attempts to conceal her struggle from close friends, articulating a logic of resilience. She keeps saying to Kosha Ali's character, "I don't need your help." But we see in the film her race, gender and youth function as mutually intensifying feedback loops of precariousness that delimit her capacity to bounce back from what's happening to her and the setbacks that are heaped upon her. At its close, the film shows her pain as her brother is taken into separate foster care in Hastings on the south coast, but also the bonds of friendship that continue to sustain her. The film's ending combines handheld mobile phone footage shot by its young actors with cinematography capturing the choreography of their bodies as they film themselves frolicking on a sunlit beach. The final scene, in that sense, echoes the opening of Rocks, which shows them, as depicted here, as shown on the slide, them singing and dancing atop a tower block facing the towering spectacle of the City of London. And this scene foregrounds the film's reclamation of spaces of social realism through the playful intervention of its teen girl collaborators. There's a sense here of an echo of that long shot of our town from that hill. Rather than emphasising the forms of escape actualised by the endings of Fish Tank and American Honey, Rox's final shot is a self-portrait filmed by Becrae with her iPhone. It's accompanied by the soothing strains of jazz collective Kokoroko, a South London group that blend Western jazz and West African Afrobeat through improvisation, mirroring the production process of the film. This final combination of music and image resists an emphasis on resilient overcoming and foregrounds the centrality of its cast of young collaborators in its challenge to neoliberal aesthetic norms. Whilst Fish Tank and American Honey ultimately conclude with narratives of escape, this final shot crystallises Rox's importance as a new form of social realism that merges traditional elements, especially authenticity of place and casting, with a deliberately aestheticised use of music that emphasises place and community. That aestheticisation offers not a retreat from politics, but a meaningful response to neoliberalism and what I've identified as the role of the dancing girl within its contemporary logic. With the very short time I have left, I just want to offer some final thoughts on Bird, which is a film that I'm just starting to think about, to show how I think that its incorporation of dance and music continues to form the substance of Arnold's engagement with the diffuse but pervasive operations of neoliberal power in a more recent post-COVID, post-Brexit context. So if you've seen Bird, it extends Arnold's usual stretching of the conventions of social realism into magical realist territory. It depicts 12-year-old Bailey navigating an unconventional home life in a squat that she shares with her chaotic but caring Irish father, Bug. Bailey's sense of uneasy rootlessness is mirrored by a character called Bird, a hybridised bird man who appears out of nowhere in the scrubland near where she lives. Like Arnold's other films, the musical register is really rich. It's made up of British and Irish music primarily. No, completely, I think. And affords a key narrative role to Britpop and early 2000s sort of dad rock. And there are big needle drops for Coldplay's Yellow and also Blur's The Universal. The musical landscape works alongside attention to the specific geographies of the estuary interzone where Bailey lives, her attentiveness towards her siblings and the birds that she films on her mobile phone, and the magic realist register forge an aesthetic encounter with the interconnected national, gendered, anthropocentric and ethnic power structures that shape her life. Bird seems to me to be a natural successor to American Honey and Fish Tank, while sharing something of the tentative hopefulness of Rocks. It's set, I was going to put a map up, it's set just on the other side of the Thames estuary to Fish Tank, so just across the water from Dagenham where Fish Tank is set. And although younger than Star, Bailey seems connected to her in so many ways. Just like Star, she has a multiracial identity, and whilst not mentioned overtly, again, this articulates Arnold's ongoing interest in paralleling identitarian hybridities and transitions with spatial ones. Bailey is in a period of transition. She starts to menstruate over the course of the film, and she shears off her hair as an act of resistance to Bugs demanding that she wear a pink outfit to his hastily planned wedding. And Bailey's in-betweenness also seems to mirror Bird's, who seems to be neither bird nor man, German nor British. Like Arnold's previous girl-centred films, music plays a central role, and it opens with this scene of Bailey and Bug speeding through Gravesend on an electric scooter to Fontaine's DC, Is It Too Real For You? There's a wry humour here that sits uneasily alongside the film's emphasis on the abuse we see Bailey witness. Here Arnold seems to be confronting her critics of her hyper-realist approach to social realism, but also foregrounding self-consciously her move into magic realism. The real here is framed in terms of love, fun and care. The Irish punk music that's used here is just one way that the film gestures towards a specific post-Brexit context. There are other ways the film does this. First, in terms of its estuary setting, the interzone might be seen in light of what Halle says about interzones, as ideational spaces that provide a sense of being somewhere that unites two places, transitionally or temporarily, and which invite the formation of new imaginative communities. Bird, I think, spatially alludes to Gravesend as a kind of left behind European interzone via this bridge across what I think is the old Eurostar train line that used to run to Ashford but now doesn't, that Bailey repeatedly crosses in the film. It's also there in the references to Irishness with Bug and Fontaine's DC, and of course Bird, played with a strong German accent by Franz Rogowski. The sense of the film as an imaginative interzone is complicated by the film's use of music, particularly this final scene at Bug's wedding, which continues to preoccupy me as it's got sort of line dancing in it, and it's so similar to that line dance scene in American Honey. In these final moments of the film, Bailey's shown dancing along with everyone to Cotton Eye Joe. It's a really exhilarating sequence, very immersive in situating the viewer amidst the dance. As Bug sings the Universal, Bird returns to say goodbye, reassuring Bailey that everything will be all right. Bailey sheds a tear, turns back to the room and her father and shares a smile with him. We see, and I couldn't find this shot anywhere, she's retained something of her encounter with Bird. Her eyes have become eagle-like, bird-like, amber and glassy. I've mentioned that the endings, and this is the ending of the film, of Arnold's films, hold central significance in thinking about their neoliberal or hopeful eco-feminist register. I think it works with the grain of the text to read these final scenes as quietly uplifting, showing that Bailey's been shaped by her encounter with Bird, and rather than turning away from her father's white working class community, she can return to it and embrace the warmth it has to offer her. But I think this optimism is weighed against a nostalgic look back to a hopeful turn-of-the-century moment that was the origin point of neoliberalism and the European cultural project. Blur's The Universal that Bug is singing here is not insignificant as a song about neoliberalism's promise of happiness. To conclude, by reconfiguring British social realism through the lens of haptic, poetic and latterly magic realism, Bird seems to strive for an aesthetic unfixing of the oppressive binaries, gendered, racialised, national, ecological, that underpin post-Brexit Britain. This intervention underscores the enduring political potency of the new social realism that I've discussed today. These films' intimate engagement with embodied experience of their vulnerable protagonists operate in tandem with the sonic, kinetic and digitextual meanings embedded in popular music and dance. Together, these elements construct an aesthetic political response to the usually concealed forms of isolation and marginalisation faced by their vulnerable girl protagonists. In this sense, the audiovisual style of the films are not a poetic distraction from the political forces that marginalise Mia, Starr, Rox and Bailey, but central to how they engage with neoliberalism's subtle yet pervasive reach. Attending to these films and their sonic, kinetic and digital dimensions is vital, as it's through the interplay of those registers that they reach beyond the confines of late capitalism and the late capitalist real towards hopeful alternatives that are both tangible and fragile. Thank you.
Can I kind of open up with questions to the audience? Who has got any kind of comments or questions for Alice? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that paper. Brilliant. Really enjoyed it. My question, I suppose, is around the relationship in Arnold's work between, and some of the scholarship around it, between dance and girls' bodies and sex work. And it strikes me that, of course, you're going to be critical of girls, like children, and that relationship to spaces of sex work where there might not be a huge amount of choice, and at the point where you're talking about children seeing that as an escape route, there's a problem. But I suppose I'm kind of interested in the fact that these films have often no space in which dance as or a way of making money from the sale of the image of the body or from sex has any other possibility than a really I suppose negative neoliberal. I mean, it's something that predates neoliberalism as well, so that I think is quite interesting in the context of your paper. But yeah, I just wondered if there was any scholarship around that, or if you were doing any thinking, because we know that those spaces for adult people, do offer lots of potential and lots of possibility, and don't only have to be read in that particular way. And the experiences of people in those spaces, what they say about their experience of them is often quite different to that kind of, tacky, sad, depressing, violent one that we see on screen. And of course, you mentioned FKA Twigs, who's since the stuff with Sheila Booth has kind of become this incredible pole dancer.
It's become eusexual, which
amazing ways and really sensual ways. Yeah.
Yes. I think you've hit the nail on the head with the fact that she's primarily looking at very vulnerable girls and perhaps using sexual violence maybe as narrative shorthand for all of the different oppression that those girls face, that in Mia's case is to do with her age and her gender, but in the case of Star is also racialised as well. I'm personally looking for political possibilities in Arnold's later work, and I agree that that's an example where she's using sort of a narrative shorthand as a metaphor in a way that isn't necessarily productive in its look at the way that sex might operate for these girls, because she's concerned with their lived experience of the now rather than the possibilities that the future might invite. She looks towards that in American Honey with her kind of look out into the eco-feminist perspective. And I think she's toying more with it in Burge, but again, she has a very young protagonist where it's not a moment where sex could be empowering yet. So I agree with you that she uses sex as a negative, not a positive, and that's to do with the age, gender and race of the characters that she's constructing, and also a focus on their lives now as opposed to the hopefulness that might exist outside of it. But I think that she's a filmmaker that's trying to find hopefulness in particular spaces and is struggling to do that because of the neoliberal forces that are acting on her characters. I'm also thinking about her film Cow in your question as well, which is a film that I think looking at, although I didn't today, is really central to any look at Arnold, because it's about the dairy industry and the sort of colonisation of the female cow's body for profit. So yeah, I think she struggles to see bodies as a way that is solely empowering. But that's my problem with a lot of scholarship on Arnold, that dance is perceived to be sort of an act of freedom for Star or for Mia, when really it's quite constrained. That was a very roundabout way of answering your question, but I would love to see a sex positive film, a sex work positive film from Arnold as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Yes.
I'm really relieved that you just mentioned Cow, because I was going to sort of send a check whether you watched it before I asked my question, which kind of just jumps off the back of all of that. It was a really wonderful paper. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. But yeah, like I was thinking about Cow a lot while you were talking and talking about sort of embodied female experience, and obviously Cow is about embodied female experience. It's just that the female in question is a cow, and I think what I'd love to hear you pull out a little bit more is that sort of like talking at the end about these ideas of like reaching beyond neoliberalism, and obviously like anthropocentrism is a function of neoliberalism in a lot of ways, and the reaching beyond that, and sort of like maybe I'm just asking you to talk your paper through even more, but like how are you looking at that reaching beyond, and where is that sort of taking you with this kind of work?
Yeah, I think there are other kind of scholars that are looking for it. Katerina Pashkevich, who I mentioned on the slide, who's looking at sort of ecofeminism. Michael Lawrence would be another example of that particular dimension of Arnold's filmmaking as being a productive way of going beyond just critiquing this is what about community isn't working within neoliberalism. This is how it can be co-opted. This is what happens to the girl body within it. And I think scholars are finding it within the ecofeminist register. But what that doesn't account for me as someone who's interested in social realism specifically is that it involves a turn away from the human community, specifically at the end of American Honey, which I also think intersects sometimes in that writing in problematic ways with the way that black bodies have been associated with sort of nature and the animal that isn't really given enough weight in those examinations. So something I'm interested in, and I'm just starting to research really because I'm writing the chapter for my book at the moment that's about American Honey, and I'm kind of having ongoing thoughts about Bird, is how multi-raciality or it used to be called or mixed race studies, the specific focus that she has on hybrid identity and whether she is using that in a productive way to think through how we imagine beyond the binary in lots of different ways. And I suppose that's what I'm talking about in Bird, in that it strikes me that Bailey's character, it's very important that her mother is also non-white, she is non-white. Her mother in the scenes with her mother is abused, but there seems to be like a productive political potential in Bug and his white working class community, but also something very sort of like nostalgic and 1990s and not very current about that. It's almost like there's a wry commentary on the history of British social realism going on within the text. But again, I'm talking about the productiveness in neoliberal terms of Arnold's filmmaking, in terms of critique, not necessarily in terms of what she's imagining. So to go back to the anthropocentrism thing, that's why I think there's that hyper-focus in scholarship on that dimension, because you can find the hopefulness there, but I'm also looking for it within the human as an antidote to that erosion of the social within like capitalism. That's why I'm always looking for productive moments in social realism where there is community building and there is spaces of resistance, which is why I'm so drawn to Rocks, and maybe should have ended with it because that's maybe more of a hopeful ending than the Return to Bird. I didn't talk about Cal there, but Cal's also interesting in this regard.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got quite a few hands. So two more questions. Can I go? Yes.
Thank you. I found it really interesting. Thank you. I've got a question about cast members who have been chosen, because their lives are almost in such close proximity to what's going to be portrayed on the screen. And I'm thinking about sort of exploitation. I must admit, I was feeling quite uncomfortable. And like young girls, quite often use dance as self-expression. It might be a leap into fame, a leap out. Their life. And are they actually being exploited in these things?
Yeah.
And it sort of seems to me to be a bit close to a poverty hole, you know, sort of, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's a big, I think this is one reason that I wanted to talk about Rocks alongside the focus on Arnold, because that's something that's been always at the edge of people's thinking about what Arnold does. The example of Katie Jarvis, who plays Mia in Fish Tank, is a really interesting example there, and she was completely on Tilbury Town train station, as I said, completely plucked out of obscurity. That film went to Cannes and sort of projected Arnold into everyone's thinking about new social realism. But Katie Jarvis had some work on EastEnders, I think, but I saw recently that she was arrested for an altercation on Southend seafront. So her life has not gone on an upwards trajectory in the way that we would like to see in terms of aftercare for people whose lives are being used like this. Where I think it's different is Rocks, because Arnold, they're her own films and she writes them, whereas Rocks was made in this very collaborative way through workshopping, where the girls themselves were involved throughout the process. They've also gone on to to be in other things, so they've been able to sort of forge an acting career out of that. But that's not the case, and the same with Sacha Lane actually. But that wasn't the same for Katie Jarvis, and I wonder whether that speaks to perhaps a progression in terms of Arnold's ethical framework. But I don't think it was there for Fish Tank, and I think it comes through a collaborative process and a process of aftercare and staying involved with your participants that I'm not sure Arnold always does. That emerges, I think, within the aesthetics of the film themselves. Something I didn't mention about American Honey is all of the trap and the hip hop that's played in the van. It was all the kids' music. It was all the stuff they were listening to. It made its way into the film. The one they absolutely hated and never wanted to dance to was We Found Love, because it wasn't their musical, taste at all, and they talk about hating it. So interesting for me that that's a moment where Arnold is using that song, I think, definitely as a mode of critique, because it's a horrible thing that's happening. It's a horrible thing that's happening, but it's a really uplifting song, and there's that contrast, and you're meant to get something out of that. I don't think that's an unusual reading to say something dark is happening with this song here. The fact that they didn't like it and didn't want to dance to it is really uncomfortable, I think. And you, of course, don't see that in Rocks, where they love Banku Dada. You can see that they love it on their faces. So I think the more I write about music and social realism and politics and aesthetics, the more I see that process, not only of co-construction of the story, but the co-construction of the aesthetics as being of crucial importance when you're thinking about the politics and ethics of the film that emerges from that.
Thank you. And I think also, just to kind of add to that, when I read interviews with Arnold on Fish Tank and Katie Jarvis, she was very uncomfortable in answering kind of questions.
She's really cagey about it.
Really kind of cagey. And I think 'cause with Katie Jarvis after EastEnders, she also she couldn't find any more acting work, and I think she went to work in B&Q.
Yeah. I saw her in Basildon Town Centre like 2 years later pushing a pram around, and thought, what? But also, I was 17, she was 17. I was thinking, to me, you're a big star.
Yeah, it's really, and I think just social realism. I think there is workaround to kind of think about how non-actors, in production processes, even going back to kind of cares, and inherent kind of issues around the employment of non-actors. And I think you're right to kind of point about how Rocks is it's a complete process of care and encouragement, and how they filmed that film. So yeah, there's a lot, I think.
Yeah, and that about. I think that's I don't know whether that's Gavron or the way that sort of rep cinemas have taken up that film. There's an upcoming season that's about care at the Warwick Arts Centre, where we're going to invite Teresa Coco and some of the cast members to talk about it. And there's been lots of events like that around Rocks and the collaborative process, because that is the dimension that people are most interested and most want to talk about. So not only is it there's an involvement from before, but also post-production, where those actresses are still involved in the reception of the film.
Yeah. Good, thank you. So one last question. Yes,
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you very much. I just want to follow on from what you said, because as I'm watching it, I wasn't aware of, and this is probably people are going to think I'm really awful after this, but I just wasn't aware of these films. I wasn't aware of this director. I saw them for the first time yesterday, and now even more from you. And my first reaction was, this is very voyeuristic and very exploitative. Made me feel very uncomfortable as a teacher, because I'm around people like this all the time. And but that wasn't the question I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you about your sort of critical methodology, the focus on neoliberalism. Are you critiquing this through the lens of neoliberalism, or are you critiquing neoliberalism through a Marxist lens, or are you is it a hybrid? That's what I was going to ask you.
I'm trying to look beyond a Marxist lens in my look at how the films engage with neoliberalism, is the way that I would frame it. I would say that, for instance, Nwonka, who I quoted at the start, looks at new social realism through a Marxist framework and finds it very wanting as a result, because he's looking for an engagement with the state. And my claim is that these films are opening up an insight into the erosion of the state and the encroaching of neoliberalism as an aesthetic form within all of our lives that tells us something about what our possibilities are. So that's what I'm looking at. New social realism as being poetic and haptic and not focused on how we should all join a union and fight together against neoliberalism, because she's focused, for instance, Arnold, on girls who are really situated within an underclass where that kind of community doesn't feel like a possibility for her. And neoliberalism as being the way that I'm looking at how that position is delimited for the girls within these films. That's a roundabout way of saying why it's not it's not precisely a Marxist framework, because there's been, and that phrase, the erosion of the social, this is what these films are confronting, I think. They're confronting the erosion of the social, the difficulty that you might experience in finding your community within the neoliberal context. And this is why I'm talking about resilience discourse as being a primary mode that neoliberalism uses in order to delimit those possibilities, by saying that if only you can bounce back, if only you're pretty enough and resilient enough and spectacular enough, you should be able to take whatever happens to you as a result of racism or sexism or classism. You yourself have it within you. If you take care of yourself enough, you can bounce back from that. And we see these resilient performances everywhere that say, look, at even this oppressed person can still bounce back from what's happened to them. We see it everywhere. And that's what we were encouraged to do in COVID, I think. There was an erosion of the state during COVID. There wasn't organised responses, but we were just told, you have the reserves within you, transform that into performances of resilient overcoming. And I think that's what Arnold is engaging with here. She's inviting us through this pop music to connect those two things, we're expecting to see a resilient performance of the dancing girl, because that's what music and music videos tell us that we should be doing. And pop music in particular, and she's inviting dialogue of that ideal with the underclass that ideal conceals. And I think that's the dialogue that she's bringing together. So while there are, and I've offered lots of critique of the films and the ways that they might be exploitative or voyeuristic, you can use all of these words, I think, but I think Arnold's concern is the aesthetic operation of neoliberalism and how that tells us about the conditions of possibility of our lives. And that's why her films, and Rock's too, is so aestheticised.
May I just add very, very briefly, is when I think of Warhol, his approach was, look, I'm doing something important here, and there will be casualties. And I do see the same thing here, is that neoliberalism seems to be the perfect lens, but I actually am coming from the other side, that the artist in question, the director, is saying, look, I'm doing something important, whether it's for the good of humanity or the good of me or whatever, but it's important, and maybe there will be casualties.
I don't think she says this, though. I think perhaps that's me more than Arnold. Arnold does not express herself as saying, she doesn't say I'm a political filmmaker at all. And in fact, most of the writing about Arnold says that she's not a political filmmaker. My position is that she is, but not because she's doing anything overtly political. So I'm not saying that this is a type of filmmaking we should be all striving towards, or this is the only way of making political films, or this is a new version of politics that I particularly prefer. Please, join a union. But I'm saying that these films are political in the way that they're encountering the political aesthetics that are dominant in different ways. So that's what I'm arguing.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks. I think we're going to wrap it up there. So, from just show our appreciation.